This is by Dorothy Cummings.
I said that.
No,
Well, I
no
know, but
fact.
it's a sad.
Yeah.
It wasn't by your bedside.
Yeah, okay. Oh, good. You brought some cards.
I have a lot more cards in the car because I have all those I just printed.
Oh, good.
But
Well, we should when we're done, just bring those over. These are nice.
Hello, everyone. Greetings and welcome to Stories to Share. I am Joe Steinfield. I'm the moderator of this series, and I'm delighted to have such a good turnout. How many of you are here for the first time? Well, good, and come back. We have one more program this year, and then we will resume in the fall with our 5th season. I want to acknowledge our sponsors, the Savings Bank of Walpole, Bell Tates, and the Monadnock Ledger Transfer. I should mention that our speakers are not compensated, but it is very helpful to have sponsors, and we appreciate any contributions you may make to support, among other things, the reception that will occur right after David Godine speaks, and I hope you will stay and imbibe and have a chance to speak with David. I want to acknowledge in the back of the room Sean Driscoll, who is handling audio visual today. Laura Adams, the executive director of the Monadnock Civic Center, whom you met when you checked in. Now, today, I can tell all of you something that many of you may not have known, and it is that there is a David Godine. I've been driving by that wonderful red building of his on Nutting Road for 40 years, and I'm sure many of you have as well. And David Godine was born and grew up in Massachusetts, has had a presence in Cheshire County for a long time, including a home in Dublin, not to mention that beautiful red building. He brought with him today a number of Godine books. They're on the table over here, and I urge you to take a look at them before you leave today. Now, the New York Times had an article about our speaker entitled, "Looking Back on 50 Years of Making Beautiful Books." Are there any book lovers here? You're in the right place. And this piece says, Godine can get carried away when the subject is books, and talks about printers the way other people talk about movie stars. A quote that I really like very much is that Godine publishes books that matter for people who care. Now, there is a book written by Mr. Godine called Godine at 50. It's an amazing book. Yes, maybe you can get him to sign it. I'm going to ask you to sign mine. This book, page by page, discusses 50 years worth of books in virtually every category that you can think of. Children's books, poetry, cooking, fiction, you name it. I asked David, have you read all those books? And he said, well, I have not read the collected letters of George Orwell, which he published. And my response was, well, it's a good time we're living in Orwellian times. Now, I have not read every word of this book, but I've looked at the illustration and the layout and the beauty of the book. And when I got to the end, lo and behold, this book was typeset and designed by Sarah Eisenman, who happens to be David Godine's wife. This book is a keeper, and today we're so fortunate, and it's a great honor for me to have David here to talk about his 50 years of making books that matter. David Godine.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I have to say I'm surprised and somewhat horrified to see this many people in this room. I thought if I got 20, it would be a miracle. I don't know if you remember Jack Warner, who was the senator from Virginia for many years, and he was also, I think, the fifth husband of Elizabeth Taylor. And somebody asked him on his wedding night, Mr. Warner, do you have any plans for this evening? And he replied, I think I know what I'm supposed to do, but I hope I can make it interesting. That's appropriate for the night. Just a word about the subject and me. I could talk about any number of books, but we've been invested really in New England. I think of us as a New England publisher. And I grew up here. I went to camp in Maine. I think my parents sent me away when I was 9 years old and kept me there for 2 months till I was 16. I remember going to college and people looked at me and said, you're still going to summer camp? Not as a counselor, but as a camper. And then I attended Roxbury Latin School, and I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it's the school the oldest school in continuous operation. The continuous operation is important because Boston Latin is actually older, but Boston Latin had to move to Springfield during the Revolution, so it didn't operate, whereas Roxbury stayed where it was from 1645 on. Which meant that when I went there, the tuition, I think, was $300 a year. And if you played the piano for the hymns at the beginning, it was reduced to $250. And we had 5 years of compulsory Latin and 3 years of compulsory Greek. After that, I went to Dartmouth, and if you've had 5 years of Latin and 3 years of Greek, you can sort of coast through the first 2 years of college. You don't really have to do very much. And Dartmouth, some of you may remember, used to be an all-male institution, and it was when I was there, and the Hopkins Center had just opened. And in the basement of the Hopkins Center, I think is a nod to practicality. There were a series of studios for ceramics, for woodworking, and the last one in the line was sort of captained by this little man with a mustache by the name of Ray Nash, and in the back were printing presses of all kinds, etching presses, lithography presses, a Washington Hoe press. And I thought, this nod to practicality was something that really interested me, and the course that he taught, Ray Nash taught, was really interesting, if not somewhat revolutionary. And I think it went back to the courses that Sachs taught at Harvard, because it made the point that to evaluate anything, you really had to look at the real thing. Art history up till then was really taught with lantern slides. I mean, you looked at the screen and somebody said, that's a Renoir, and here you can tell. But Sachs at Harvard really said, if you really want to be a connoisseur and know what it is, you have to look at the actual object. And that's why I got interested in printing, because A, it was working with your hands, which is something I love to do. You were producing something real. it was so real that, if you published a poem by Yeats and you sent it to a smithy, you would automatically get a date. Bennington was more into Dylan Thomas. You really had to pick your shots carefully. But I did this for 3 years, and then my senior year I had a senior fellowship, which meant there were 12 of us, that we didn't have to attend any classes. We could do whatever we wanted, we just had to show up for graduation, and I did. And I began printing and finally finished printing my first book, Lyric Verse. And I want you to know that I thought my career would start with that book. It was 112 pages, 500 copies printed 4 up. I think that means 25,000 pulls of the Vandercook. But what nobody had ever told me was I had poems by everyone from Dylan Thomas to Robinson Jeffers. Nobody ever mentioned copyright. And he lived in a farm, and I'm sure it was a real person that Hall knew. And Mary did the woodcuts, and here you see he built himself a camp on the side of Ragged Mountain and lived there alone in the big room where he kept the things he collected, thousands of rusty nails, which he found and straightened and saved, pelts from deer that he shot, old newspapers in the sack, old clocks piled everywhere, and wasp nests hanging from the, I can't read the rest of the railroad ties. And Mary managed to get all of that in that woodcut. It's a small book. I loved it because the point of the book is that people who lived alone are not necessarily weird or socially disabled or unhappy. This guy was perfectly happy living alone, and he visited his nephews and his nieces regularly. Here he is, he had I love it, he had a pet owl named Grover, and he fed Grover mice, but the problem, when we first did the book, can I go back? When we first did it, that arm was holding the mouse up to the owl. And we got so many letters from librarians, mouse lovers everywhere, saying this is really offensive, you're definitely violating a code where, you don't show people feeding an owl mice. And so we had to redo it like this. Don't ask me why. There he is, feeding, getting mouse for Grover. This, I'm sorry this looks like this, but this was the first book we did with Mary Azarian. And my family had bought a beautiful brick Federal of 1804 in North Holland, Vermont. And across the road from us was a working farm owned by Kendall and Gladys Adams. And I remember the day after Thanksgiving, way back, Gladys Adams came across the road with this pack of flashcards, about the size of playing cards, that had been given her by the state of Vermont, so that they would learn the alphabet using country themes. So M stood for maple syrup, not McDonald's. And you get the point from this, except that in the book, apple and the A are in red, and the woodcut is in black. And we did it as a big book. I mean, this is 16 inches high and about 8 inches wide. And the schools that bought them would, of course, cut them up. And you see them, across the school. And that was shortlisted for the Caldecott, which is a big deal, which she later won for the one about Snowflake Bentley. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the Caldecott winner, which was a big deal. And I remember I was playing the piano and I got a call from Mary and she said, I got this award. They want me to go to Philadelphia. It's called the Caldecott. I've never heard of this award. I said, I have a bridge game scheduled for that night, Do I go? I said, Mary, it doesn't get any bigger than the Caldecott. We've just sold 100,000 copies of the book. She went, okay, come on. Mary wanted to do this book. This is a funny story too. So this poem is recited in England, and it's basically the metaphor of John Barleycorn, who is the stalk of barley, who was basically anthropomorphized as a human being. So they cut him down, they brew beer with him. It's all about brewing beer from hops, from barley. And that was our cover. And if I can get this to work, that was the inside. Pretty nice. We had the calligraphy done by George Laws, so that's not type, it's calligraphy. And the mistake we made was, in the book, in the preface, she gives you directions for brewing beer in the bathtub. And it didn't occur to us that this was essentially, would be reviewed as a children's book. You can imagine the horror with which librarians would, I mean, I'm sure you can all imagine those hordes of children running to the supermarket, bringing back the ingredients, and unknown to their parents, brewing all this beer in the bathtub. This never happened, but sometime later, I think a few years later, wait a minute, it's going crazy now. We decided to do what she really wanted, which was to do a color version. And I think I always thought the people who drink beer deserved a book, devoted to their pastime. And there was no beautiful book about beer that we had. And we were going to give it to them. And this is what it looked like. You can see even the initials are hand colored. Every one of the borders was colored differently. It was a splendid book. I don't know how many people who read it went on to found microbreweries, but everybody was surprised. And again, notice the calligraphy by George Laws. That's really good calligraphy. He was a terrific calligrapher. And I decided, maybe a few years after this, that she really deserved her own book, mostly of the flowers, the scenery she'd done. And she did this special, we did this as a poster for the book, but it had lovely, I think we have a copy of it over there. Have any of you ever read this book? Yes. And did you ever forget it? No. It's one of the great books that we ever published. I should say that publishing note that we were a totally unknown publisher. Nobody had ever heard of Godine. This wasn't like Scribner's walking in and trying to send you a list. And the only way I could see that we could survive would be to find books like Spring Too Short to Be Saved or Disappearances that were really classics and had, for whatever reason, gone out of print. And this was before you could read a book on tape, or there were short-run printings. This was the day when a publisher really had to print 1,500 to 2,000 copies of a book to make it commercially viable. Well, Godine could print 1,500 copies of a book easily and make it commercially viable. I mean, we had books that we printed 500 copies of. So when Houghton Mifflin, who had done this book originally, let it go out of print, Viking, thank you. And it was his second book after Where the Rivers Flow North, which I think, that was Houghton Mifflin? Boy, this is a smart guy. Anyway, I read this book and I just was blown away by it. It's a Gothic tale set in the northeast corner of Vermont. It's set in 1932 at the very end of Prohibition. The father owns a herd of cows, and he realizes he's not going to make it through the winter. The only way he's going to make it through the winter is to smuggle whiskey into the U.S. and Canada. So that's what you see in the canoe going down the rapids. But it's part Gothic, it's part adventure, and it's part, like all of Motion's books are, what life was really like in the Northeast Kingdom in the 40s and 50s and 60s when he grew up there. And it was a tough life. And I think the reason the book resonates is not only is the whiskey smuggling, I think, totally accurate, but his description of life in the Northeast Kingdom, especially the winters, really just breaks your heart. But if you've ever read this book, you'll never forget it. This is Henry Beston, born Henry Sheehan, went to Harvard, joined the ambulance corps during World War I, came back, wrote children's books, believe it or not, which were the favorites of Teddy Roosevelt, and then married Elizabeth Coatsworth, who was really a much better known author than he ever was. She was a children's book author, and they bought a farm really on the lakes of Damariscotta Lake in Maine and moved up there. So the first book of Beston we did was this collection, which was really the best, which was originally published by Stephen Green Press. So this too, not the jacket obviously, but the book was basically a reprint and had some of his best stuff, including his one, I don't know if any of you remember the essays or the books on the rivers of America, but Beston wrote about the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it's just a beautiful book. So we did that, and then this was about his herb garden in Nobleboro. And it's not a book at all about planting herbs or how you grow them. It's about the lore of herbs, where they appear, and everything from the Bible to Shakespeare, done herb by herb by herb. It's a beautiful book. And what made it really special for me was we were able to locate the original wood cuts, not wood engravings, but wood cuts. You all know the difference between a wood cut and a wood engraving? This is very important. If you take a tree and you cut it lengthwise so that you have the knots and the grain all goes in one way, and you work with a knife, and you work the knife by drawing it to you, and you're usually in a fairly soft wood, maybe not pine, but maybe maple, maybe ash. That's a wood cut. And that was really the way books were illustrated for 300 years. A wood engraving is when you take a piece of Turkish boxwood and you cut it across the trunk, which is about maybe 8 inches if you're lucky. And so when you engrave it, it's a very, very dense wood, and you basically are engraving hard butter with an engraving tool. So it's really an engraving. It's done the same way you engrave in metal, except that you're engraving a piece of wood. Highly polished, with absolutely uniform grain, unlike a wood cut, which has a very definite grain to it. So these were wood cuts done by John Howard Benson, who was the dean of RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, for many years, the father of Fudd Benson, John Benson, the person who did every piece of important scriptural engraving from the Roosevelt Memorial to the east wing of the National Gallery. Right at the end of my tenure, we were approached by Daniel Payne, who really recognized that Beston, especially with the book The Outermost House, which is his life in the Nauset Beach alone for an entire year, was really the first environmental book written in America. When Rachel Carson was asked, who influenced you as a writer, she said there was only one, Henry Beston. And he lived, as this picture is actually taken with Kate Barnes, his daughter, and their dog, and you see the inflow of Damariscotta Lake in the background. And it really puts him in, it's the first biography that was done of Beston, and I think well-deserved. Garrett Kaiser lives also in Vermont, is a minister. I was pleased, I don't know if you know the book that was published recently called 1,000 Books to Read Before You Die. We had 12 books in that, which is not bad, and this was one of them. Come on. This is, Brian Tolles is now a New Hampshire resident, but at that time, I think he was down in Washington, D.C. And he came to us with the idea of doing a major architectural books on the history of the grand resort hotels in New Hampshire. And these hotels were really built between 1850 and 1890, roughly. It was actually a hotel in the foothills of Mount Monadnock that burned. They almost all burned. When he did this book of the 50 really grand resort hotels, there were only 20 that were left. Of this one in Bretton Woods was by far the largest. But he really traces the history of how they were developed, primarily the result of the railroads finally coming up into Pinkham Notch and then further making their way further north. The fact that families really, for the most part, were middle class who had the summer off, they could take time to go with their families and rent a room, one of 460 at Bretton Woods, play tennis, rusticate, and later, as you'll see, built houses. But there is the title page of that. This was followed that, and there's a copy over there, which I encourage you to look at. Many books have been published about the major architects who designed summer homes, big summer homes in New England, but nobody had ever really looked at how most of them were built, which were done by local builders using local materials. And the way it worked was, usually, you were a doctor or perhaps a teacher. You had 2 months off. You'd go to a place by a lake or a place by the ocean. You'd see a house that you liked. You didn't want to hire Plott and Lyons or McKinsey and White or Stearns and Peabody. You wanted a house you could afford and that you could come back to in the spring. And you would go to the local builder, and he identified builders in Randolph, Vermont, on the shores of the Caspian Lakes, and all along the Maine coast, where the records were still intact. In other words, the drawings were there. And they were, I wouldn't say modest homes. Some of them were extremely beautiful homes, as you'll see from this. They often designed and built the furniture. And he basically, I don't think any book had ever been written about the local builders who did, obviously, the majority of the summer homes in New England, many of which, as ours is on an island in Maine, unheated. They were strictly summer homes, no basement, no heating system. You'd show up sometime in late May or early June. You'd stay through early September, and you'd say goodbye. And the hometown builder would take care of your home through the winter months. And the irony was, Tad Pfeffer, who I visited, he lived outside of Boulder. He was evidently the leading glaciologist in America. I mean, he was in Iceland, he was in Greenland almost year-round, but he had a summer home in Randolph, New Hampshire. And that's where he really got interested in this, because he found the original drawings for his own house. And he realized that about 40% of the homes in Randolph were built by the same builder. Let's do a book about it. Now, if you're a publisher, you often get to do a book that you think are so totally off the wall, like, what in the world, who in the world would buy this book? I remember my first experience with this was a wonderful painter from Martha's Vineyard whose hobby was duck decoys. And he wanted to do a book called The Duck Decoys of Martha's Vineyard. And he called me again and again saying, you really should look at this book. This is really the last word in duck decoys. And I said, you've got to be crazy. I mean, you know, you're not even talking about duck decoys of Massachusetts. You're just talking about a small little island in the middle of nowhere. He said, no, you don't understand. This was a major flyway. All the great duck decoy builders, about which, believe me, I knew next to nothing, except I've been to a few auctions and I knew how much they sold for. And finally, Stan Murphy, he called me, he said, you know, I'm on the ferry. It was February, and I remember it was freezing cold out. He said, I'm on the February and I'm going to visit your office and I'm going to show you the book. And I said, well, we can't turn back the ferry, Stan, but you know, it's sort of a bootless journey that you're on, and you know, get some clam chowder because, you know, I'm not going to spend. He came and he showed me the book. You couldn't say no. I mean, he had laid out the entire book, page by page. You know, not the greatest typography in the world, but if you wanted a book about the duck decoys of Martha's Vineyard, this was the book you had to buy. Okay, so we're going to do 1,200 copies of this book. I'm selling books in St. Louis. I remember this. I'm selling books in St. Louis, and I so to the buyer, and naturally, when you go through a catalog, you do what's called a pass. And I passed this book right away. And she said, wait a minute, go back. She said, that's a book about duck decoys, I'll take 2 copies. And this happened again and again and again. People, you know, wouldn't buy Andre Debus, they wouldn't buy Mosher, but they'd buy the book about duck decoys because there were nuts out there that will pay a small fortune for duck decoys. And they really want to know everything they can about duck decoys. They have libraries devoted to duck decoys. So we did the book, and I remember calling back to the office and I said, increase the print run to 1,500 copies. Sold out like in 6 months. And Chris was the same way. She said, you know, curtains of New England, northern New England, it wasn't New England, it was New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. And evidently, all the towns, this was before television, it was almost before radio. You had to go somewhere for entertainment. Where did you go? You went to the Grange Hall, you went to the Town Hall, you went to the Masons Hall. And what did they have in the background? They had these glorious, huge canvas. There are some examples. These are really big. I mean, as big as that back wall, painted on canvas, and she had discovered 300 of them that were still in existence, usually rolled up, usually in terrible condition, and she had started a foundation to restore them and bring them back to life. And they are fantastic. And again, you know, she got on the MTA, she said, I'm coming, I have to show you the book. And I sort of said, come on. I was wrong. I mean, the book won the major award in New England from Historic New England. It's the best book published that year on the subject. We sold out of it. How little we do. This is our favorite Maine author who you've never heard of, but who was Donald Hall's favorite author too. And we did, I think, a total of 6 or 7 books of Wesley McNair's poetry. This was Kate Barnes. Remember Beston had that little girl on the shoulders? That was Kate, and the book was illustrated with wood cuts by Mary. Probably you know the story, but Cedar Thaxter was born in New Hampshire, in Portsmouth. Her father was a lighthouse keeper, and he kept the lighthouse on White's Island. And when she was 8 years old, he bought Appledore, an adjoining island, bigger island. And he started a colony there, which people would go to for the summer. And Cedar started that's the binding of the book. Really a gorgeous binding by Sarah Wyman Whitman, whose home still exists on Beacon Hill, and did many, many great covers for Houghton Mifflin in this period. And the book was illustrated by Shilda Hassan. That's a picture of her. This was done, these lithographs were done by Boston firm. They were up to 16 stones per lithograph. And Cedar Thaxter thought nothing of this book. There's this wonderful correspondence between her and Sarah Wyman Whitman. And Whitman says, "How's your book of gardening going?" She said, "I just can't wait to turn this into the publisher. I can't stand writing about it. It's all, it's about my garden, which I love. But what people should really be reading is my poetry." And of course, nobody was reading his poetry, and this book turned out to be a classic. And we reissued it because, again, Houghton Mifflin, who had done a very good reprint of this, had let the reprint go out of print. We thought, my God, how can we pass that one up? And this is another classic. This, of course, is Maine. And it's Maine after the Civil War. It's Maine when there's hardly a man left in the entire state. So the book really, with the exception of a single male, is all about women who are really abandoned, who are herbalists. And the drawings by Doug Alford are from real Mainers. He went around to the islands primarily. And this is the heroine of the book, who's an herbalist, as you can see. And there's no narrative arc to this book, as we always talk about in publishing. They're really a series of interrelated vignettes about people who she knew through her father, who was a doctor, who would go out to the islands to treat these people, and was beloved evidently by everybody. And Willa Cather was once asked, what are the three great books in American literature? She said, Huckleberry Finn, this, and I've never figured out what the third one was, but this was number 2. We're coming to the end. This William Cosmo is here because he's a real Mainer. He summers in Maine for 6 months, and he's totally he's really one of our great and inventive writers. And he sent me this manuscript, which was, if you've ever read Sherlock Holmes, you should read this book because the language is pure Holmesian, with the exception that all of the characters are bugs. And you laugh, but I can tell you, this is one book, come on. You can't get it to go. Can you make it go? Okay, here, okay, see the bugs? That Sherlock Holmes, that bug, says exactly how many times has this apparition been seen. To prove to you how popular this book was, I will tell you the story of my son, age 10, in the bathtub, naked. And I had read him and Maddie the stories, and they loved it. For them, there was nothing horrifying about the bugs. This was really interesting, a book about bugs. And he looked up at me and he said, Dad, you finally published something that people will actually want to read. It's exact words. Well, you can see why. And then we followed up with Double Trouble. Joe Cervello is an artist. He lives in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I had to look that up on a map, but it actually exists. And the drawings are just fantastic. I mean, they're small little books. They each have about 6 or 7 adventures in them. But if you love Sherlock Holmes, and if you can stand the insects, then these are books to read and love. There's another one. I'm going to do some of the photography books. This was George Tice. We did 5 books by Tice. He lives in New Jersey, but every summer we go up to Maine for the Maine Photographic Workshop. I met him. And this was a book about the seacoast of Maine, which was, as all of Tice's photographs were, just fantastic, I think. I think this is, what was this? Clyde? Yeah, poor Clyde, in a big fire recently. And this was Paul Caponegro. I always wanted to do a book by Caponegro. He's one of the great photographers of New England, lives in Cushing. And when the Portland Art Museum was giving a major show, we convinced them to let us publish a series we had. And Caponegro and Tice were sort of the last of a breed who were really using film. They weren't using digital cameras. They were developing the film themselves in their basements using chemicals. And come on, there we go. This one. That's the Cushing house. You know that one, the girl. What's her name? Yeah. Christina's World. That's where she lived. And finally, getting back to Benson. Now, Benson, was a Dubliner. He was here, part of the Dublin colony. He came up with Tarble, good friends with Linton. DeForest, spent 4 summers in Dublin as part of the arts colony that thrived there, but was really an outdoor artist in every way. And here he is on the Restigouche. These are all watercolors, obviously. Very fast. And in the summer, the reason he left Dublin is he bought a home on North Haven. And there's a picture of him with his pet osprey on North Haven, where he did a whole series of etchings, mostly birds, which are just terrific. And finally, Peter Korn, who I think this is one of the best jackets we ever did. It's really about the importance, again, of making things with your hands and how furniture fits into our life, and how it's hard to make a living as a craftsman, but you can do it. And ultimately, despite 2 bouts with cancer, he founded the Center for Furniture Craftsmanship in Rockport, Maine, which is now a big deal. I mean, it's got 200 people going through it every year. And if you want to be a serious furniture maker, it's one of the prime places to go. This is the last really great book we published. If you were from Vermont, if you read Vermont Life when it existed, and the other magazines, you'd always see photographs by Richard Brown, who despite his affected accent was really a graduate of Harvard. And lived up in the Northeast Kingdom, and had dragged around 15 years ago an 8x10 view camera. A really, like Matthew Brady dragged around, exactly, where you had to set up the stand, take long exposures. And he basically chronicled the way of life, which has all but disappeared. Was certainly not viable. These were small farms, terrible farmland. Most of them had small herds of cows in the days when you could make a living with 30 cows, a little bit of sugaring, as I said, some timbering, a couple of hens in the background. And the text is just fantastic. I mean, it really captures the people and what it was like to live in a way that's, I think, probably now all but disappeared. I doubt if any of these farms exist today. But it was beautiful. This was the last book I can say. We had the front page of almost every newspaper in Vermont devoted a full page to this. And we were working at the warehouse, and we printed a lot of, I think, 2,500, 3,000 copies. And we usually get orders for like 2 or 3 copies at a time. The Vermont stores were calling and saying, give me a carton. We reprinted the book. And finally, is Tom Bator here? Well, I had to include this because Tom is now a resident of Dublin.
It's a great book.
And it's a great book, an unlikely subject. Tom is the head of a very respected firm in Boston which handles trusts and estates. And if you're from Boston, and I'm an example of this, you're usually what's referred to as a trust baby. In other words, your parents didn't want you handling the money, so they gave it to a trustee to handle. And it really flourished, or the institution came into prominence during the time when Boston was the richest city in the country because of the industries, mostly the weaving and the cloth making along the Merrimack. And the problem for the families who were drowning in money, literally, was how you pass this on to the next generation without it being squandered. And you did that through the intermediary of a trustee. I sort of listened to the spiel and I said, yeah, but it's not really a big deal today. And I remember the agent said, do you have any idea how much money is under the control of Boston trustees? And I think I said, well, a couple of million maybe. He said, $32 billion. We're talking just Boston, not Massachusetts. Boston trustees. Mostly independent firms, not the banks. And Tom runs one of the best. And he traces the whole history of trusts and estates, what you should know if you're a beneficiary, what you should know if you're thinking about passing on your wealth to the next generation, and how the law in Massachusetts really enabled people to invest much more aggressively and much more liberally than in almost any other state in the country. Benjamin Franklin, when he died, left $1,000 to Philadelphia and to Boston, the same amount, with the stipulation that it couldn't be spent for 100 years. At the end of 100 years, Philadelphia's was worth about $250,000. Boston was worth $3.2 million. We invested it very well. So that's the end of my talk, except I'll end it with a little anecdote by Cass Canfield, who was a legendary editor at Harper & Row. And he had written James Thurber, as editors often do, saying, I know you've been with other publishers before, but you really should consider Harper for your next book. It's sort of a fishing campaign. And Thurber had obviously heard this line before. And he said, you know, fishing for publishing is a lot like sex. You never know what's going to happen between the covers.